Hi, welcome or welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. Actually, I've been wanting to make this video for a long time now, but there are just too many thoughts in my mind and I've been struggling to find a starting point, but finally here we are. Many people say this is a novel where almost nothing happens, and yes, I think in a sense it is true because the plot is very simple. It has 3 parts, and Woolf described the structure as 2 blocks joined by a corridor. Part 1, the window, introduces us to the Ramsay family as they planned a trip to the lighthouse, but the trip was ultimately cancelled due to bad weather. Part 2, time passes, is like a corridor of time where 10 years pass, people die, the family leaves, the house stands empty enduring the passage of time. And in part 3, the lighthouse, the remaining family members finally made the journey to the lighthouse. So that's basically the story. There's no big adventure, no dramatic twists, and it doesn't really fit into categories like tragedy or comedy or romance. And instead, the novel is about how consciousness moves, about how life is experienced in its fleeting, fragmented, and luminous moments. It's written in the third-person narration, but the perspective is constantly shifting, like it drifts from one character's mind to another. And even when we stay inside one character's consciousness for a while, the thoughts are often drifting, leaping, or interrupting one another. And this so-called stream of consciousness is meant to mimic how our mind actually works. Because we rarely focus on one thing for long before another thought barges in. In her essay, Modern Fiction, Woolf writes, "Examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms. And as they fall, as they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the accent falls differently from old. The moment of importance came not here but there, so that if a writer were a free man and not a slave, if he could write what he chose, not what he must, if he could base his work upon his own feeling and not upon convention, there would be no plot, no comedy, no tragedy, no love interest or catastrophe in the accepted style, and perhaps not a single button sewn on as the Bond Street tailors would have it. Life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. Life is a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end." And then she goes on to say, "Let us record the atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each side or incident squirts upon the consciousness. Let us not take it for granted that life exists more fully in what is commonly thought big than in what is commonly thought small." So Virginia Woolf is turning this inner life, this flickering flow of consciousness, into a literary form. And in this sense, simple as the plot is, To the Lighthouse is all-encompassing, I believe, because life itself is all-encompassing. And perhaps this is where the power of literature or the power of art more broadly really comes from. Because, recently I was listening to a podcast where Taiwan writer Zhu Tianwen spoke about her collaboration with filmmaker Hou Xiaoxian, and she recalled Hou saying cinema comes from non-cinematic things. And she extended this to literature, and she said literature too comes from non-literary sources. It comes from life itself. And that made me think immediately of Virginia Woolf because I think To the Lighthouse is so powerful and so endearing precisely because it springs directly from life. To Woolf, art isn't a decoration on life, nor is it something set above it. Art is life and life is art. And in a way, we're all part of that creation. And Woolf actually expresses a similar idea in her autobiographical collection, Moments of Being, where she writes, The whole world is a work of art. We are part of the work of art. Hamlet or a Beethoven quartet is the truth about this vast mass that we call the world. But there is no Shakespeare, there is no Beethoven, certainly and emphatically there is no God. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. I believe this is what To the Lighthouse is really about. It's often considered her most autobiographical novel, and I think The Journey to the Lighthouse somehow mirrors Woolf's own journey of literary exploration. Virginia Woolf was born in London in 1882 into a large intellectual Victorian family. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was a prominent writer, historian, and philosopher. Her mother, Julia Stephen, was renowned for her beauty and generosity. She was like the emotional center of the family, and she devoted much of her life into charitable work. Virginia grew up among 8 children, but her mother died when she was just 13, and 2 years later, her half-sister Stella passed away. And in 1906, her brother Toby died at the age of 26. And these losses shadowed the rest of her life and contributed to her mental health struggles. And in many ways, To the Lighthouse was like Woolf's attempt to return to that lost world and heal. In a sketch of the past in this collection, she reflects on this process. I suppose that I did for myself what psychoanalysts do for their patients. I expressed some very long felt and deeply felt emotion, and in expressing it, I explained it and then laid it to rest. The Ramsay family's summer house is based on the Stephen family's holiday home in St. Ives, Cornwall, where Woolf spent some of the happiest years of her childhood, and from that house, she could see the lighthouse that would later become the novel's central image. Mrs. Ramsay is closely based on Woolf's mother. She is nurturing, luminous, generous, while Mr. Ramsay reflects her father, who was intellectually brilliant but quite anxious, emotionally demanding, and at times tyrannical. And then there's Lily Briscoe. She is a friend of the family and an artist who spends years trying to complete a painting of Mrs. Ramsay and her son, James. And I think Lily largely draws from Woolf herself and perhaps also from her older sister, Vanessa Bell, who became a painter. After their father's death in 1904, the siblings moved to Bloomsbury, where Vanessa and Virginia became central figures in the Bloomsbury group. That is a famous circle of writers, artists, and thinkers who championed intellectual freedom, personal honesty, and bold experimentation, and this environment was crucial to Woolf's modernist writing. But to understand Bloomsbury, I think we also have to understand what they left behind, because before the move, the family lived at 22 Hyde Park Gate, and that was a rigidly conventional household that Woolf described as a complete model of Victorian society. It was a world governed by patriarchal authority and strict social rules. And Woolf wrote that her and sister Vanessa's relationship with their father was like 2 different ages confronted each other in the drawing room at the Hyde Park Gate, the Victorian age and the Edwardian age. Explorers and revolutionists as we both were by nature, we lived under the sway of a society that was about 50 years too old for us. It was this curious fact that made our struggles so bitter and so violent. For the society in which we lived was still the Victorian society. Father himself was a typical Victorian. So the move to Bloomsbury felt like a liberation, as Woolf puts it. We were full of experiments and reforms. We were going to paint, to write, to have coffee after dinner instead of tea at 9 o'clock. Everything was going to be new. Everything was going to be different. Everything was on trial. Being able to read and write was important. In To the Lighthouse, whenever Lily Briscoe tries to paint, a voice intrudes her mind. Women can't paint, women can't write. This is the voice of Charles Stanley, who is also one of the Ramsay's guests. And I think Lily's struggle to finish her canvas kind of mirrors Woolf's own fight against the rules of her time. In A Room of One's Own, Woolf argues that male values are constantly carried over into literature. Speaking crudely, Football and sport are important. The worship of fashion, the buying of clothes, trivial. And these values are inevitably transferred from life to fiction. This is an important book, the critic assumes, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. Well, To the Lighthouse does not deal with nations or wars. It's a domestic novel focused on the inner life of a single family. Even Lily's painting depicts nothing more than a mother and a child, but that doesn't make it less powerful than a so-called grand narrative of war. And in a note she wrote while working on this novel, Woolf says, "How much more important divisions between a people are than between countries, the source of all evil." For Virginia Woolf, the deepest conflict and the most meaningful revelations are not found on battlegrounds or in history books, but in the intimate, everyday spaces of human relationships. Mr. Ramsay is a quintessential Victorian patriarch. He governs the household through absolute certainty and harsh judgment. At the beginning of the novel, his son, James, is eager to go to the lighthouse, but Mr. Ramsay insists that the weather will not allow it. And when Mrs. Ramsay gently suggests that the wind might change, her husband is infuriated because to him, the extraordinary irrationality of her remark represents the folly of women's minds. So I think in his world, rationality and truth belong to men, while women are irrational, ignorant, and emotional. But I think this anger doesn't really come from someone challenging his truth, because more often than not, I believe anger is a mask of lack of confidence. It stems from a deep underlying insecurity. He is a man who constantly demands emotional reassurance from those around him, especially from women. He needs Mrs. Ramsay's sympathy, her admiration, and her unwavering belief in his greatness. And after her death, he turns to Lily for that same. And Woolf herself saw this clearly in her own father. Here's how she describes her father in A Sketch of the Past. "Why then had he no shame in thus indulging his rage before women? Partly, of course, because woman was then, though gilt with an angelic surface, the slave. But that does not explain the histrionic element in these displays. His dependence on women helps to explain that. He needed always some women to act before, to sympathize with him, to console him. Why did he need them? Because he was conscious of his failure as a philosopher." So Mr. Ramsay is exactly this kind of figure. There is a theatrical quality to his suffering. He depends on the sympathy of women to sustain his ego, performing his greatness while being secretly tormented by the fear that his work won't endure. And another similar figure, I believe, is Charles Stanley, who keeps repeating, "Women can't paint, women can't write." And on the one hand, he dismisses the entire female gender as an obstacle to male progress, but on the other, he is hypersensitive to women's opinions. Like, he's desperate not to look foolish in front of them, and he is terrified that they might look down on him. And I think this is where Woolf does something really brilliant, because through Lily Briscoe, she kind of turns the gaze around. As they sit opposite each other at the Ramsay's dinner table, Lily sees right through him, as in an X-ray photograph. He was really, Lily Briscoe thought, in spite of his eyes, but then look at his nose, look at his hands, the most uncharming human being she had ever met. Then why did she mind what he said? Women can't write, women can't paint. Why did that matter coming from him, since clearly it is not true to him, but for some reason helpful to him? And that is why he said it. I think we might call this female gaze because it is the woman who is judging the man. Patriarchal culture usually reserves the power of judgment for men alone, but through this female gaze, we can ask, where does this supposed superiority actually come from? How much of it is genuine confidence and how much is just a fragile ego masking their deep insecurity? Mr. Ramsay is a man obsessed with reaching Z. He imagines human thought as a linear progression through the alphabet. He has confidently reached Q. That is an impressive achievement because very few people in the whole of England ever reach Q. But he is also painfully aware that he will never reach Z. Very interestingly, Virginia Woolf's own father, Leslie Stephen, was the founding editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. It cataloged the lives of Britain's great men in alphabetical order, and it celebrated individual male achievement as the primary engine of history. This actually reflects the Victorian era's worship of the great man. This theory was most famously articulated by Thomas Carlyle, who argues that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. Mr. Ramsay is a firm believer in this. He believes that Z is only reached once by one man in a generation, and he measures his entire worth against this ideal. Yet, he is stuck at Q, unable even to reach R. He imagines himself as the leader of a polar expedition who, knowing he is doomed to die, refuses to die lying down, so that when his body is found, it will appear noble and heroic. But I think what really intensifies his suffering is his realization of how insignificant even a great man is in the face of time. His fame lasts perhaps 2,000 years, and what are 2,000 years? Asked Mr. Ramsay ironically, staring at the hedge. What indeed, if you look from a mountain top down the long wastes of the ages? The very stone one kicks with one's boots will outlast Shakespeare. His own little light would shine not very brightly for a year or two, and would then be merged in some bigger light, and that in a bigger still. So I think Mr. Ramsay sees the emptiness at the heart of this heroic greatness, yet he cannot imagine any other way to achieve life's meaning. So even knowing it is futile, he consciously performs the heroic pose, squaring his shoulders and standing upright by the urn. He keeps repeating a line from Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Someone had blundered. He is like the soldier in that poem, in a battle obeying the orders that he knows are wrong. Well, Victorian ideals were built on stoic endurance, self-sacrifice, and a belief in the inevitable progress of human knowledge. But by the 1920s, when Woolf was writing to the Lighthouse, those foundations had somehow collapsed. World War I shattered the Victorian confidence in order and certainty, and it left behind a profound sense of disillusionment. And this collapse is felt most powerfully in the novel's second section, Time Passes. In this chapter, human characters almost vanish from the stage, and the empty house becomes the protagonist. For nearly a decade, the summer house stands vacant as time flows impersonally. Winds batter the walls, darkness settles in, and nature slowly reclaims the space. And human events are reduced to mere brackets. Mrs. Ramsay dies quietly one night, Andrew is killed in a war, Prue dies in childbirth, and I think in a traditional Victorian novel, these deaths would be the climax, but here they are brief incidental notes in the brackets, and they're overshadowed by the house's slow decay and the vast unbroken rhythms of the sea and stars. The universe appears immense and indifferent. It offers no consolation for our losses. So against this backdrop, the grand narratives like heroism, empire, intellectual fame look small, and Mr. Ramsay's desperate drive toward Z somehow dissolves into insignificance when set against this march of time. So how do we find meaning in the face of such indifference? Virginia Woolf doesn't fall into nihilism. She doesn't say that life is meaningless because our achievements are so tiny. And instead, she argues the meaning is found not in historical permanence, but in the fleeting instant, what she calls moments of being. In a sketch of the past, Woolf describes most of our daily life as numbing, Like we move through routine as if we're padded in cotton wool. We're half conscious, letting the days pass by unnoticed, but every now and then we experience a moment of being, a sudden shock of awareness triggered by joy, beauty, or even pain. And in that instant, the cotton wool falls away and we glimpse a hidden pattern beneath the surface of things. And Woolf writes that in such moments, I am hardly aware of myself, but only of the sensation. I am only the container of the feeling of ecstasy, of the feeling of rapture. And in To the Lighthouse, we see many such moments. For example, Mrs. Ramsay experiences a moment of being during her dinner party. She hovered like a hawk suspended, like a flag floated in the element of joy which filled every nerve of her body fully and sweetly, not noisily, solemnly rather. For it arose, she thought, looking at them all eating there from husband and children and friends, all of which rising in this profound stillness. She was helping William Banks to one very small piece more and peered into the depths of the earthenware pot. Seemed now for no special reason to stay there like a smoke, like a fume rising upwards, holding them safe together. Nothing need be said. Nothing could be said. There it was, all round them. It partook, she felt, carefully helping Mr. Banks to a specially tender piece of eternity, as she had already felt about something different once before that afternoon. There is a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change, and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights, in the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby, so that again tonight she had the feeling she had had once today, already, of peace, of rest, of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. So this night of bringing people together, of creating harmony, however brief, is Mrs. Ramsay's moment of being. She finds that eternity exists in these fleeting seconds. This is the hidden pattern she discovers beneath life's cotton wool. It is a realization that Lily Briscoe, years later, would come to share. 10 years later, when Lily returns to the empty summer house, she recalls a simple image. Mrs. Ramsay sitting under a rock, writing a letter. That woman sitting there writing under the rock resolved everything into simplicity, made these angers, irritations fall off like old rags. She brought together this and that and then this, and so made out of that miserable silliness and spite. She and Charles, squabbling, sparring, had been silly and spiteful. Something, this scene on the beach, for example, this moment of friendship and liking, which survived after all these years complete, so that she dipped into it to refashion her memory of him, and there it stayed in the mind, affecting one almost like a work of art. And while recalling that scene, an old question rises again, one that has haunted Lily for years. What is the meaning of life? She's been waiting for some great revelation, a lightning bolt from the sky, but now she has finally come to realize the great revelation had never come. The great revelation perhaps never did come. Instead, there were little daily miracles, illuminations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. Here was one, this, that, and the other, herself and Charles Dansley and the breaking wave. Mrs. Ramsay bringing them together, Mrs. Ramsay saying, life stands still here. Mrs. Ramsay making of the moment something permanent, as in another sphere, Lily herself tried to make of that moment something permanent. This was the nature of a revelation. In the midst of chaos, there was shape. This eternal passing and flowing, she looked at the clouds going and the leaves shaking, was struck into stability. Life stands still here. Mrs. Ramsay said, Mrs. Ramsay, Mrs. Ramsay, she repeated. She owed it all to her. Lily has finally realized there is no great revelation from outside, no divine answer, no great man standing above the rest of us with all the answers. The meaning of life lies in these fleeting, flickering moments of daily life. the little daily miracles we shape into something that endures. As Woolf writes in her memoir, there is no Shakespeare, there is no Beethoven certainly, and emphatically there is no God. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. In A Sketch of the Past, Woolf reflects on her own childhood memories in Sign Types, those vivid scenes in the nursery or on the road to the beach, and she feels these moments are more real than the present moment, and she wonders, is it not possible, I often wonder, that things we have felt with great intensity have an existence independent of our minds, are in fact still in existence? And if so, will it not be possible in time that some device will be invented by which we can tap them? I think there is a metaphysical element there because she's essentially saying that these moments of being are not destroyed by time. They may continue to exist in the fabric of reality, waiting to be re-accessed. So in a sense, they are eternal. But what then is reality? When James finally reaches the lighthouse she longed for as a child, what he sees is nothing like the lighthouse of his memory. The lighthouse was then a silvery, misty-looking tower with a yellow eye that opened suddenly and softly in the evening. Now, James looked at the lighthouse. He could see the whitewashed rocks, the tower stark and straight. He could see that it was barred with black and white. He could see windows in it. He could even see washing spread on the rocks to dry. So that was the lighthouse, was it? No, the other was also the lighthouse, for nothing was simply one thing. The other lighthouse was true, too. So Woolf is suggesting that reality is subjective and multifaceted. It is shaped by perspective, time, emotion, and memory. She rejects the Victorian idea of a single objective truth, and instead, multiple versions of reality coexist and they are all equally valid. The lighthouse can be many things at once, and so can people. Lily once found Mr. Ramsay and Charles Stanley unbearable because to her they represented the patriarchal forces holding her back. But 10 years later, after the devastation of war, her perspective somehow softens. The war had drawn the sting of her femininity. Poor devils, one thought. Poor devils of both sexes. I think the war kind of stripped away the grand illusions of male authority. Lily no longer sees these men as simply as oppressors. She also sees that they are trapped too by their own rigid masculine ideals, like the pressure to achieve greatness, to hide vulnerability, to perform stoic heroism even when it's futile, and she realizes that half of one's notions of other people were, after all, grotesque. They served private purposes of one's own. So when she recalls that morning on the beach, seeing herself and Charles Stanley playing together while Mrs. Ramsay sitting aside, watching them, Lily realizes how precious those moments of connection truly are. And in that memory, her anger dissolves and she reaches her reconciliation, I believe. And Lily also has complicated feelings toward Mrs. Ramsay. Because on the one hand, Mrs. Ramsay represents the quintessential Victorian woman. She is devoted to marriage, convinced that a woman's role is to support her husband, raising children, and never let her own light outshine her husband's. And she believes that men's work is what truly matters, and that women find their fulfillment in nurturing others. And Lily resists all of this. She chooses her painting over marriage, and yet she loves Mrs. Ramsay. After her death, Lily misses her terribly. She misses those luminous moments when Mrs. Ramsay brought everyone together, weaving harmony out of chaos with effortless grace. And Lily longs to fully understand Mrs. Ramsay, to penetrate her private inner world. She wants to capture the full essence of Mrs. Ramsay on her canvas, but she finds that a daunting task. Woolf actually felt the same about her own mother. In A Sketch of the Past, she writes, "If one could give a sense of my mother's personality, one would have to be an artist. It would be as difficult to do that as it should be done as to paint a Cezanne." But at the end of the book, Lily finally lays down her brush and thinks, I have had my vision. She finishes her painting. But is that Mrs. Ramsay on her canvas real? Well, yes and no, because 10 years ago, Lily had desperately wanted to understand Mrs. Ramsay completely, even to merge with her. Sitting close to her, leaning her head on Mrs. Ramsay's knee, she imagined secret chambers in her mind and heart filled with sacred tablets of wisdom. What art was there, known to love or cunning, by which one pressed through into those secret chambers? What device for becoming, like waters poured into one jar, inextricably the same, one with the object one adored? Could the body achieve, or the mind, subtly mingling in the intricate passage of the brain or the heart? Could loving, as people called it, make her and Mrs. Ramsay one? But nothing happened, no fusion, no total knowledge. How then, she had asked herself, did one know one thing or another thing about people sealed as they were? Only like a bee, drawn by some sweetness or sharpness in the air intangible to touch or taste, one haunted the dome-shaped hive, ranged the wastes of the air over the countries of the world alone, and then haunted the hives with their murmurs and their stirrings, the hives which were people. But 10 years later, Lily accepts this solitude. We can never fully understand or merge with another person because, in a sense, we are always alone. What we know of someone is always a construction of the mind. It is built from memories, emotions, and imagination. But this constructed version, the Mrs. Ramsay in Lily's heart and on her canvas, is, in its own way, profoundly real, just as the two lighthouses are both equally real. And another character who finally reconciles with this kind of solitude is Mr. Ramsay. Toward the end of the book, he is on a boat to the lighthouse with his children James and Cam. As they sail, he recites lines from William Cowper's The Castaway. We perished each alone, but I, beneath a rougher sea, was whelmed in deeper gulfs than he. This poem is based on a passage in George Anson's A Voyage Round the World, where a sailor fell overboard during a storm, and despite his friends' efforts to save him, the ship was moving too fast and they had to abandon him to the ocean. In her diary on May 14th, 1925, Woolf wrote that the center of this novel was to be the father's character, sitting in a boat, reciting, "We perished each alone," while she crushes a dying mackerel. Mr. Ramsay believes he is as lonely and as desperate as that castaway sailor. He imagines himself beneath a rougher sea. He is suffering more profoundly than anyone else, because as a philosopher battling the darkness of ignorance and forever struggling to reach the next letter in his intellectual alphabet, he casts himself as a solitary hero. He craves recognition for this unique pain, and after Mrs. Ramsay's death, this need for sympathy becomes even more urgent. But to his children, James and Cam, it feels suffocating. And yet, Mr. Ramsay also has his moment of being. When an old man points to a spot at sea and mentions that 3 men drowned there long ago, Mr. Ramsay reacts in an unexpected way. 3 men were drowned where we are now, said the old man. He had seen them cling to the mast himself. And Mr. Ramsay, taking a look at the spot, was about. James and Cam were afraid to burst out, "But I beneath a rougher sea." And if it did, they could not bear. They would shriek aloud. They could not endure another explosion of the passion that boiled in him. But to their surprise, all he said was, "Ah," as if he thought to himself, "But why make a fuss about that? Naturally, men are drowned in a storm." But it is a perfectly straightforward affair, and the depths of the sea, he sprinkled the crumbs from his sandwich paper over them, are only water after all. Then, having lighted his pipe, he took out his watch. He looked at it attentively. He made, perhaps, some mathematical calculation. At last he said triumphantly, Well done. James had steered them like a born sailor. It is a praise James has been waiting for his entire life. Because from the first page of the novel, we see James as a young boy who resents his father intensely. He even fantasizes about stabbing him with a knife, and this hatred lingers into adulthood. James sees his father as tyrannical and self-absorbed. Mr. Ramsay, meanwhile, he is trapped in his own despair. He is largely blind to the emotional needs of those around him. But in this moment, when he hears that 3 men drowned where he now sits, I think he suddenly realizes that his suffering, his obsessions, his sense of tragic uniqueness are not exceptional at all. They are part of a larger, shared system. The depths of the sea are only water after all. So he loosens his grips on himself and turns his attention outward toward his son. He may never reach Zed. His work may not have a permanent place in history. His name may not last, but why does that matter? He finally bridges the gap between a father and a son. And what happens in a family is no less universal and no less profound than the greatest movements of history because it contains the deepest truths of life. And as the father and son finally reach the lighthouse, back on the lawn, Lily Briscoe turns once more to her canvas, and she thinks, "It would be hung in the attics," she thought. "It would be destroyed. But what did that matter?" she asked herself, taking up her brush again. She looked at the steps. They were empty. She looked at her canvas. It was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there in the center. It was done. It was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue. I have had my vision. Lily completes her painting, and she too reaches her lighthouse. She once described painting as an odd road to be walking. Out and out one went, further and further, until at last one seemed to be on a narrow plank, perfectly alone over the sea. And now at last she has had her vision. 10 years earlier, that vision had already come to her. She saw the color burning on a framework of steel, the light of a butterfly's wing lying upon the arches of a cathedral. And 10 years later, that vision remains unchanged. Beautiful and bright it should be on the surface, feathery and evanescent, one color melting into another like the colors on a butterfly's wing. But beneath the fabric must be clamped together with bolts of iron. It was to be a thing you could ruffle with your breath, and a thing you could not dislodge with a team of horses. Her painting captures the most fleeting, delicate emotions, the shimmering, transient beauty of life, while anchoring them in something unshakably strong and enduring. And that, to me, is the power of art. That is the power of Virginia Woolf's domestic stream of consciousness novels. And that is the end of my review of To the Lighthouse. Please feel free to leave me a comment and share your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.